The true spiritual path exists, the teachings of Ibn Arabi. I spent years searching for the spiritual path as if it were hidden somewhere outside of me, in books, teachers, distant places, complicated practices. The more I searched, the more confused I became. Then I encountered Ibn Arabi, and with a few lines he shattered everything I thought spirituality was. He wrote that the true path does not begin with movement, but with recognition. Not recognition of God somewhere far away, but recognition of God already present. He said people get lost, not because the path is hidden, but because they are looking in the wrong direction. The path, he taught, is not ahead of you. It is beneath your feet, inside your breath, within the awareness that is already watching. When I stopped trying to become spiritual and simply became honest, something changed. I noticed how fear dissolved when I stopped resisting life, how answers appeared when I stopped demanding them. Ibn Arabi called this the unveiling, not gaining something new, but removing what blocks seeing. He taught that every hardship is guidance in disguise, every delay is mercy wearing a mask, every person you meet is a mirror placed deliberately in your path. The true spiritual path, according to him, is not escaping the world, but seeing God reflected in it without confusion. When love deepens, knowledge bows. When surrender becomes natural, effort becomes unnecessary. I realize that the reason so many people feel lost is because they are trying to walk a path instead of allowing themselves to be carried by it. Ibn Arabi said, "The seeker and the sought are not two. The moment this is understood, the path ends, not because you failed, but because you arrived. The true spiritual path exists, but it does not demand perfection, isolation, or mastery. It asks only for sincerity, awareness, and trust. And when those settle in the heart, guidance is no longer searched for. It unfolds quietly, inevitably, exactly where you are." As I sat with Ibn Arabi's words longer, I began to notice how radically different his path was from everything I had been taught. He did not ask me to withdraw from life, to silence my humanity, or to fight my desires as enemies. Instead, he asked me to understand them. He wrote that nothing appears in the heart without permission, and nothing is placed on your path without wisdom. Even confusion, he said, is a form of guidance, if you do not rush to escape it. I stopped labeling moments as spiritual or worldly. Eating, working, failing, loving, all of it became part of the path once I stopped resisting it. Ibn Arabi taught that God reveals himself through forms, and the mistake is not loving the forms, but forgetting the source reflected in them. When I grasped this, guilt left me, fear left me. I no longer felt divided between heaven and earth. The path was no longer something I walked only in prayer. It was something that walked me through every breath. He said the heart that truly knows God expands until it can hold opposites without breaking. Certainty and doubt, joy and grief, strength and weakness. I realized then that the true spiritual path does not make you smaller or stricter. It makes you vast. And in that vastness, nothing feels out of place anymore. With time, Ibn Arabi's teachings began to dissolve the last illusion I carried, the idea that arrival looks dramatic. He taught that the greatest transformations are almost invisible because they do not announce themselves. They simply settle. I noticed that I no longer needed constant reassurance, signs, or emotional highs. My faith became quiet, steady, unshakable. I stopped measuring my progress by feelings and started recognizing it by absence. The absence of panic, the absence of resentment, the absence of the need to control outcomes. Ibn Arabi wrote that the heart aligned with truth no longer argues with destiny. That sentence alone ended years of inner struggle. I understood then why he said the true knower walks among people unseen. Not because he hides, but because he has nothing to prove. The path did not remove my humanity. It purified my relationship with it. I still felt pain, but it no longer defined me. I still desired, but desire no longer ruled me. Everything took its proper place. Ibn Arabi taught that when the heart is emptied of false ownership, divine wisdom flows through it effortlessly. Life stopped feeling like a test and started feeling like a conversation. Guidance was no longer something I waited for. It was something unfolding continuously, moment by moment, exactly as needed. That is when I realized the most radical truth of his teachings. The true spiritual path does not lead you away from yourself. It returns you to yourself, stripped of illusion, standing calmly in the presence of what has always been. And in that return, I finally understood why Ibn Arabi insisted that the path cannot be owned, named, or claimed. The moment you say, "This is my level," or "This is my station," you have already stepped away from truth. He taught that the heart must remain fluid, because God reveals himself in ever-changing forms. Fixation is the real veil. I noticed how suffering returned only when I tried to freeze meaning, when I demanded permanence from moments meant to pass. When I let life move, it moved gently. Ibn Arabi said that certainty is not the absence of change, but comfort within it. That insight rewired how I lived. I stopped clinging to identities, spiritual, personal, even moral. Instead, I paid attention. Attention became worship. Presence became prayer. The path simplified itself until nothing extra remained. I no longer asked, "Am I doing this right?" because the heart that is present is already right. Ibn Arabi wrote that God is found not by effort, but by availability. When I became available to grief, to joy, to not knowing, guidance flowed without resistance. The true spiritual path existed all along, not as a road to walk, but as a way of seeing. And once seeing changed, everything else followed naturally, quietly, without force. And with that seeing, even the idea of seeking slowly dissolved. Ibn Arabi warned that many people spend their lives searching for God while standing directly in front of him, simply because they expect him to appear in a form they recognize. He taught that God reveals himself according to the capacity of the heart, not according to the seeker's expectations. I realized then that impatience was never spiritual hunger. It was resistance to the present unveiling. The moment I stopped asking when clarity would come, clarity arrived. Not as answers, but as steadiness. Not as explanations, but as trust. Ibn Arabi said that the knower does not need certainty explained, because certainty feels like rest. And that rest became familiar to me. I stopped trying to interpret every event, stopped asking what each sign meant. Life no longer needed decoding. It only needed presence. Even prayer changed. It became less about asking and more about witnessing, less about words and more about standing openly before what is. Ibn Arabi taught that when the servant stops managing the relationship becomes real. That was the final shift. The true spiritual path revealed itself not as effort or attainment, but as intimacy, quiet, constant, and ordinary. Nothing extraordinary on the surface, yet everything transformed underneath. And I understood at last. The path exists because it is simply the courage to remain present with God as He is, not as we wish Him to be. And from that intimacy, a strange freedom emerged. Ibn Arabi taught that the moment the heart stops demanding certainty, it is entrusted with wisdom. I no longer needed to know why things happened. Meaning revealed itself only when it was needed, and vanished when it was not. I saw how suffering sharpened awareness, how loss widened the heart, how confusion humbled the intellect into listening. Nothing was wasted. Ibn Arabi wrote that God does not repeat himself, yet he is always the same. And this paradox stopped troubling me. Life could change endlessly without threatening truth. I stopped fearing mistakes because I understood that even error moves within divine permission. The true path does not promise safety, it promises coherence. Everything begins to make sense not intellectually, but existentially. I felt aligned even when I felt uncertain, calm even when outcomes were unclear. Ibn Arabi said the sign of true guidance is not ecstasy, but stability. That stability settled into my days like a quiet anchor. I could walk through noise without losing center, through praise without inflation, through hardship without collapse. The path was no longer something I practiced. It was something that practiced me. And I finally understood why Ibn Arabi said that the greatest unveiling is simplicity. When nothing is forced, nothing resists. When nothing is claimed, nothing is lost. This is the true spiritual path, not dramatic, not distant, not reserved for the few, but available to anyone willing to see without grasping, trust without demanding, and stand quietly in the presence that has always been there. And so the journey came to rest, not because something was achieved, but because nothing needed to be added. Ibn Arabi's teachings did not lead me to a destination. They returned me to presence. The true spiritual path exists, not as a ladder to climb or a role to perform, but as a way of being awake inside life as it unfolds. When striving falls away, sincerity remains. When control dissolves, trust takes its place. When identity loosens, intimacy with the real appears naturally. This is the quiet end Ibn Arabi pointed to, where seeking ends, not in emptiness, but in fullness without effort. Nothing dramatic marks this moment. Life continues, work continues, joy and grief still visit, but something essential no longer wavers. The heart knows it is held, and once that knowing settles, the path is no longer something you follow. It is something you are.